Today, we are once again beginning our walkthrough of The Gay Science by Friedrich Nietzsche, and this time we're finally starting on Book 3. First, I'll briefly recap what we've considered so far in the first two books, because it's been so long since the last walkthrough episode. These first two books are not the easiest stretch of Nietzsche's work to summarize, however, because of his aphoristic style, at times seemingly disjointed style. He doesn't write in that classically philosophical way in which each section, establishes syllogisms which build upon one another in a kind of logical chain, which is why it's so often said that Nietzsche is anti-systematic. But nevertheless, we'll go over the main premises that Nietzsche presents at the beginning of the book. So first, in the preface, Nietzsche centers the project of this book around the unity of body and soul. We might say unity of the physical and the intelligible. It's long been the project of philosophy to separate one from the other, but Nietzsche seeks to do the opposite, show us how even that separation is something physiological in origin and that they're in fact unified. And perhaps the best ready-to-hand example is how the priestly classes and their invention of the world of the spirit is their own attempt to gain power by positioning themselves, the spiritual men, the ascetics, as superior to the warrior classes. Or, ugly and botched Socrates, the master logician who makes the intelligible world of ideas the true world, and the physical world is relegated to being a false world. And what comes with Nietzsche's attempt at unifying the physical and the intelligible is a consequent unity, therefore, of true world and appearance. And if we'll remember, the preface ends with his exaltation of the Greeks, who stopped heroically at the surface, who lived in appearance out of profundity. So then what does Nietzsche talk about in Book 1? Well, many things, but one of the main premises introduced at the beginning is the idea that all the teachers of a purpose of existence have been, in some way or another, a tool of nature, or a tool of life. What does he mean by this? That life is lived, life advances, a species advances in absentia of quote-unquote reasons to live. And while we could see those who give us a reason to live as superfluous, that's not exactly true either. Really, they are another trick, another seduction of nature, another seduction to live that does function in that manner. Even the tragic or metaphysical interpretations of existence, which Nietzsche would say are errors, have been such a seduction to life. And here by tragic, we mean more like pessimistic or something like that. He also argues that it's not only the good people, the people who follow the conventional morality, that have advanced the species, that in fact evil types of people have advanced the species. And this dovetails into a discussion of the eternal conflict between the ordinary type and the extraordinary type. As I've put it somewhat metaphorically, between the genome and the mutation. The types we call evil are like mutations. Anything different, individual, peculiar is called evil. And these exceptional types have advanced the species just as much, if not more so, than the rule. And what follows that are a number of passages in which the will to power is introduced, albeit in an implicit way. He doesn't quite use the term yet, but Nietzsche discusses a number of phenomena such as struggles for political ambition, but also love, the pursuit of scientific truth, and so on and so forth, as all driven by a desire for a feeling of power. He discusses how the virtues that we celebrate may in fact spring from what we call vices, an insight that he later develops more in Beyond Good and Evil. He talks about what our laws betray about us, how our moralities or our mores conceal something of our instincts or attempt to suppress the instincts while being themselves a reification of instinct. And so ultimately he describes life as a kind of experiment in which different types are tested and tempered and are either rejected or become the rule. And overall, no matter which way we go, whether we choose to follow instinct or attempt to regulate instinct according to moral law, or whether we unify body and soul or attempt to intellectually separate body and soul, it's all the experiment of life. It's all the work of nature, who is the true great artisan of mankind. And so, Book 1 establishes the physiologism of Nietzsche, as I have called it, in some ways his fatalism. No matter what, you're part of this experiment called life. No matter what, all of your intellectualizing about it, your rules, your principles are a part of that. And whether you perish or succeed, it's all to the benefit of life itself, to speak poetically or metaphorically. And rather than treating our fate as these playthings of nature as a dreary, woeful state of affairs or something like that, as perhaps Schopenhauer would, Nietzsche concludes Book 1 on a joyous note. He says, "I wish to paint my happiness on the wall," and that this is the gay science. Book 2 is a bit looser with the theme. It contains that long stretch on women, relationships, and the social life, which I think that's part of Nietzsche's attempt to emulate French aphorists, these writers who talk about moral insights on everyday life. But broadly speaking, even those musings fit into the theme of Book 2 because Book 2 is framed on a further meditation on truth versus appearance. The primacy of appearance is, of course, central to the social life and central to Nietzsche's subversive ideas about morality and about his insights into what's really going on in many social interactions. There's an outward pretense and an inner truth. And that creates an interesting paradox, you might say, insofar as Nietzsche is attempting to unify truth and appearance. But remember, Nietzsche begins this book by asking us, that cloud there, what is real in it other than what you bring to bear in perceiving it? That's Nietzsche's sort of innovation on German idealism. The German idealists separated phenomena and noumenon, appearance and thing in itself, which is an error because it makes the appearance seem to be less real than the truth. But that can also be the first step in abolishing the need for a quote-unquote true world in the first place. In short, Book 2 mostly deals with Nietzsche's project of perspectivism, the various ways in which this new viewing of the world, an anti-Platonist view of the world, creates new paradoxes, many of which Nietzsche argues in this book are sort of artifacts of language itself. Nietzsche more or less establishes his project in Book 2 as a kind of reclamation of science for his own purposes. Science is not the investigation of an Aristotelian world of substance or an objectivist world that, where the appearance, quote unquote, really and truly exists, or whatever that might mean in an objective, mind-independent sense. Science is the investigation of appearance, nothing more, nothing less. To put it glibly, death to metaphysics, right? And as Nietzsche will say later in the book, long live physics. And Nietzsche is willing to take on all the problems that come with this abolition of metaphysics. The fact that, for instance, all we have is the fallible perception of various perspectives and conflicting information and conflicting reasoning, all of which is motivated. That may be true, but it's not a justification for having recourse to a mendacious, false metaphysical world, simply to quote-unquote fix the problem. And so Nietzsche concludes Book 2 with a statement of gratitude for art and the fact that it has fostered what he calls a cult of untruth. This will be our way of surviving the hard-boiled realism of pure science, or scientism. This is, in fact, the nature of Nietzsche's gay science, his joyous, carefree, frolicking science, which realizes that it is investigating appearance, which means it's investigating perspective, which means there's always subjectivity and artfulness and therefore arbitrariness in our every construction of reality. This will all become very important in Book 3. Nietzsche calls into question here many of the so-called certainties of science, the fact that these so-called certainties are artifacts of that intelligible world, that reality itself is a chaos or a flux, and our attempts at ordering it, categorizing it, and so on are, in fact, in so many words, falsifications. And that might seem to place us again before the problem of the two worlds. But I would argue that this is not the case. What's really happening is that Nietzsche is pointing out how many of the supposedly scientific certainties that we hold to are actually metaphysical prejudices. These are actually false judgments. They're erroneous judgments. They may have been necessary for us in order to cognize the world at all, but it's based on metaphysical oversimplifications or just flat-out distortions, the error of substance, of thinking phenomena as independently existent bodies, or the error of duration, and so on. And Nietzsche will discuss all of these in Book 3. And so with that, let's get into it. Even though Nietzsche's already been lobbing dynamite throughout the first two books, Book 3 is where the gay science really starts to take off, in my opinion. It contains some of the most significant aphorisms, and it begins with the first appearance of one of Nietzsche's famous ideas, God is dead. But this is not the madman passage. That comes a bit later. This is the first presentation of the idea that God is dead. It's a much shorter passage, and let's get right into it. 108, quote, New struggles. After Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there will still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown, and we, we still have to vanquish his shadow too, end quote. So there are potentially a couple of references here. If you look online about this, people will say there's a Buddhist legend that Gautama Buddha left behind a shadow on the wall of a cave. I've also heard some people say the legend actually referred to Bodhidharma, the founder of Zen, but that Nietzsche misunderstood that. Or you'll see people comparing it to Plato's allegory of the cave. And I think, other than the Bodhidharma thing, which is almost certainly false, it's a little bit of both. So it took me a bit of digging to actually find the source for this legend, or I guess a bit of spelunking, right, because it concerns caves. But what I found is from the record of Faxian, who is a Chinese Buddhist historian from the 4th century AD. He traveled west along the Silk Road. He spent some time in Central Asia. He spent 10 years in India. He visited a number of Buddhist kingdoms. He came from actually a very interesting time in Chinese history. He was born during the 16 Kingdoms period, and that's a time of basically civil war in China. And that's also like roughly the time when the Buddhization of China occurred, if we may call it that. Incredibly fascinating time period I could talk about for a whole hour, but in the interest of doing a Nietzsche podcast, I won't. The relevant information here is that Faxian was definitely not referring to Bodhidharma, since Bodhidharma wasn't born yet, and the site he mentions in modern-day Afghanistan was almost certainly not a site visited by the historical Siddhartha Gautama. Things get a little complicated when it comes to claims about where Buddha was or what Buddha did, especially when we get into Mahayana Buddhism, because there are potentially many Buddhas, and also sort of like the magical or the divine aspect of Buddha is more present in Mahayana belief. Or anything can happen, right? But anyway, this is what Faxian says, quote, "Half yojana or so south of the Nagarahara city is a rock cavern amid rolling hills facing southwest. Here the Buddha left a shadow. Viewed from a distance, the shadow appears as if it were Buddha's true form, a radiant golden image in full splendor. Upon approach, the image fades into tantalizing obscurity. Kings of various regions have sent skillful painters to make copies of the image, but none have succeeded," end quote. Now, it's also worth saying there are multiple such shadow caves where there's said to be an image of Buddha that recedes as one approaches it. And I guess we could wax philosophical about perspectivism here, the nature of optical illusion, the pattern recognition equipment we have in our brains playing tricks on us. That isn't really the interesting part of this passage anyway. Whether or not Nietzsche intended to reference the record of Faxian, or whether he heard this legend some other way, what's important here is the connection that Nietzsche surely would have made in his thought to Plato's allegory of the cave. Let's think about this legend of Buddha's shadow in those terms for a moment. The real object, or in this case the real subject, the actual great man, the legislator in Nietzsche's understanding, Gautama Buddha, guy who legislated a new morality, he dies, but he leaves behind an imprint, an impression on the minds of men. And according to Plato, these impressions are what constitute the reality for most men, for all who are not philosophers anyway. And, in terms of when Plato is talking about shadow images, of course, Plato means the senses, but, we should think about Nietzsche's remarks in his notes about the types like Buddha whom he calls legislators. He also mentions Plato and Muhammad. They give mankind a series of thou shalts, a new tablet of values, or we might say a new valuation of values. But Nietzsche says that these were, in their origin, an I will, something that came out of the will of the legislator. That there was an artfulness, a subjectivity, an irrational demand for something at the foundation of this new table of values. But that in the legacy of such people, we deceive ourselves. And perhaps the legislator himself is even deceived into thinking they're a mere instrument of the divine. Or in Buddha's case, you could say he's an empty phenomenon who attained realization and turned the wheel of the Dharma. We could say the Buddha is simply a vessel of the Dharma. The comparison Nietzsche makes is that the Christian God is the same. The Christian God, who we can say is given to us by Jesus or by Paul or by the early church fathers or whoever, is the shadow, the remnant of an I will, an arbitrary declaration of a new tablet of values, a new revaluation. But the collective, the herd, doesn't perceive this. They see the shadow, which in Plato's allegory, that's a mere facsimile, which is mistaken for reality. The great masses of people don't comprehend the true event, that what has actually happened is the legislatory activity of one man who was placed by causes and conditions into a position where he can reauthor mankind's values. They see the shadow. They see the facsimile of a man, which has been made into a kind of idol. And really, the legend of Buddha's shadow in Afghanistan is perfect because of the fact that it recedes as one gets closer to it. It's a kind of ephemeral idol, something that looms over us. Nietzsche describes it as gruesome, perhaps we might say monstrous, but we can't grab hold of it. The closer we get to examining it, it escapes from us. And in that way, it is like the ideal. And so what Nietzsche does in this passage is not only make a conceptual link from this Buddhist legend to the allegory of the cave, he takes the thrust of Plato's allegory and flips it on its head, because the ideal becomes the shadow. The real man, the origin of the ideal, the physiology, the organism, the clever animal that birthed the ideal, that is the true subject that casts the shadow. So again, a Nietzschean reversal. The intelligible world is the false world. The sensory world, which is to say the world of appearance and of where there exist bodies and physiologies, that's the true world. And even this division between true and false is a sort of fiction, but really it's a hermeneutical technique for getting across the deeper point about the unity of physiology and intelligibility. The end of the passage, I think, is the most straightforward. The shadow of God looms over us, so the conditions that birthed, that necessitated the Christian God, which Nietzsche will later elaborate on this in the genealogy, those have passed, but the shadow still looms over us for thousands of years. Why is this? Well, he says this is the way of men. So we establish these collectives bound under tablets of value, and the collective inclines toward this stability, we might say stagnation, rigidity. And as such, even now that God is dead, the shadow still looms. What does God is dead mean? We'll discuss that in more detail as we get to the later aphorisms on this, but it means the Christian God has become unworthy of belief. That's the shorthand. No one actually believes in this anymore. To draw on something Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil, the evidence that Christians don't believe like they used to is that they no longer burn us. The level of commitment that the nominal Christian has today pales in comparison to the Christianity of the Middle Ages. And there are a number of reasons for this, which we'll discuss all that later. But the point is, even as the belief has become merely nominal, the shadow of God still looms because of that inclination to rest within the established values or perceptions, which Nietzsche has discussed in Book 1 of The Gay Science. The fact that what is considered good is what has been considered good over long generations, what pleases the heart, what's handed down from father to son, and what is evil is what is new and different. And so it is going against the grain to attempt to vanquish the shadows that loom over our thought. They like to linger, right? But as Nietzsche says, we have to. It's worth noting that those who interpret Nietzsche's death of God idea as a lament over the decline of Christianity have to reckon with this passage too, that he says, not only is God dead, we have to vanquish his shadow too. That's a rather problematic statement for that interpretation. And remember the name of the aphorism, New Struggles. So the implication is obvious. Nietzsche's new struggle is to vanquish the shadow of God. These are not the words of a man who is sad that God is dead. He's saying we have to even move beyond the legacy of the Christian God in our thinking. And maybe that doesn't apply to everyone. Maybe it doesn't apply to the entire mass of human beings, but it does apply to Nietzsche's readership at least. So with that, let's move on to 109, a section called Let Us Beware. Quote, let us beware of thinking that the world is a living being. Where should it expand? On what should it feed? How could it grow and multiply? We have some notion of the nature of the organic, and we should not reinterpret the exceedingly derivative, late, rare, accidental that we perceive only on the crust of the earth, and make of it something essential, universal, and eternal, which is what those people do who call the universe an organism. This nauseates me. Let us even beware of believing that the universe is a machine. It is certainly not constructed for one purpose, and calling it a machine does it far too much honor. Let us beware of positing generally and everywhere anything as elegant as the cyclical movements of our neighboring stars. Even a glance into the Milky Way raises doubts whether there are not far coarser and more contradictory movements there, as well as stars with eternally linear paths, etc. The astral order in which we live is an exception. This order and the relative duration that depends on it have again made possible an exception of exceptions, the formation of the organic. The total character of the world, however, is in all eternity chaos, in the sense not of a lack of necessity, but of a lack of order, arrangement, form, beauty, wisdom. and whatever other names there are for our aesthetic anthropomorphisms. Judged from the point of view of our reason, unsuccessful attempts are, by all odds, the rule. The exceptions are not the secret aim, and the whole musical box repeats eternally its tune, which may never be called a melody. And ultimately, even the phrase unsuccessful attempt is too anthropomorphic and reproachful. How could we reproach or praise the universe? Let us beware of attributing to it heartlessness and unreason, or their opposites. It is neither perfect nor beautiful, nor noble, nor does it wish to become any of these things. It does not, by any means, strive to imitate man. None of our aesthetic and moral judgments apply to it, nor does it have any instinct for self-preservation or any other instincts. And it does not observe any laws either. Let us beware of saying that there are laws in nature. There are only necessities. There is nobody who commands, nobody who obeys, nobody who trespasses. Once you know that there are no purposes, you also know that there is no accident, for it is only beside a world of purposes that the word accident has any meaning. Let us beware of saying that death is opposed to life. The living is merely a type of what is dead, and a very rare type. Let us beware of thinking that the world eternally creates new things. There are no eternally enduring substances. Matter is as much of an error as the god of the Eleatics. But when shall we ever be done with our caution and care? When will all these shadows of God cease to darken our minds? When will we complete our de-deification of nature? When may we begin to naturalize humanity in terms of a pure, newly discovered, newly redeemed nature? End quote. So in this section called Let Us Beware, let's review the things that Nietzsche says we have to beware of. Nietzsche says that we have to beware of making various sorts of claims about existence, or we might say nature, or we might say physical or material existence, the universe, the cosmos, however you want to call it. Let's look at what Nietzsche says to beware of doing, which we can take to mean these are all thought tendencies. These are inclinations in thinking that you're liable to fall victim to and ought to avoid doing if you really want to understand nature. So the very fact that he says you should beware, that you should avoid these things, suggests that there's a tendency to do them. So recognize these tendencies as your projections onto reality. So what are these projections? That the universe is itself an organism, that the universe is a machine, that the universe is orderly and follows predictable patterns, or that the universe obeys laws, or that the universe creates new things. And along with these, he also gives a series of dichotomies, both of which he says to avoid: that the universe is irrational, or that it is rational; that the universe is heartless, or that it cares about mankind; that the universe is purposive, or that the universe is governed by random accidents. None of this is really permitted logically. So let's go through the arguments he gives. Is nature an organism? Well, the basic point is that it seems that life is an exceptional thing. We're taking this unusual phenomenon going on only on the crust of this planet, something that he says is derivative, late, and accidental, which is life, and then using that as a metaphor to describe the totality of all existence, but where it doesn't really fit, because do we actually perceive an existence which is, for one, primarily living? I mean, no, if we take the totality of physical existence, at least from all appearances, it's not alive. Nietzsche suggests, that living matter is the exception to dead matter. It's only a form of dead matter, a very exceptional form of it. But quite simply put, all of the attributes of a living organism, that it feeds on things, that it reproduces itself, how could we apply that to the totality of all existence? It doesn't make any logical sense. So why would we do this? Well, perhaps because we are living beings. And we might say this kind of prejudice appears in world religions. It goes way back to like the Chinese creation myth of Pangu, or, which involves the idea the universe is created from the body of a living being, or to some extent maybe the Hindu idea of everything being part of Brahman. Or, we might say there are modern derivations on this. We might think of Spinoza or any kind of pantheism, that all of nature is synonymous with God, which is presumably some sort of living entity. So why doesn't Nietzsche agree with then calling it a machine? Well, he says it wasn't constructed for a purpose, the way a machine was. There's no telos for existence. And he doesn't make this argument in this passage, but maybe you've seen, the meme that right after man invents the wheel, he postulates that existence is itself like a wheel, as in, say, Hinduism. Or when he invents the written word that existence is like a book, like, say, the Christian Bible, or when he invents mechanical gears and steam engines and so on, what follows is this mechanistic worldview. And you might be familiar with the watchmaker analogy, which is a form of Christian apologetic, which sort of capitulates to that prejudice. In other words, calling the universe a machine is another anthropomorphic reflection of ourselves and the human world, so to speak. And Nietzsche, later in the passage, even seems to attack his own framework somewhat, to implicitly draw attention to the ways in which his own framework that he's presented in this book is another anthropomorphism. And that is that even speaking of nature's unsuccessful attempts, as Nietzsche himself has done, is incorrect. He's spoken of nature as a kind of experiment, the various forms of life, and even these various kinds of human life as different attempts or tests at creating this exception. But what is this? This is Nietzsche, as one of those teachers of the purpose of existence, bringing to bear his own perspective on existence, and doing so for his own aims. So Nietzsche is telling you the idea that nature is an experiment is something that you should be aware of. Or at least don't take that as an absolute. Don't take that as a objective truth about the world. There's that sentence in the middle of this passage where Nietzsche says, quote, "The whole musical box eternally repeats its tune," end quote. Kaufman says that's a reference to eternal return, but I'm not exactly sure about that. I think the thought was probably already in his mind, and he is invoking the idea of a cyclical universe in the broadest possible sense. But what is he saying in context? He says, quote, "Judged from the point of our reason, unsuccessful attempts are by all odds the rule, and exceptions are not the secret aim, and the whole musical box eternally repeats its tune, which may never be called a melody," end quote. And it's right after this he says, even to call the unsuccessful attempts, to call them by that name is incorrect. So in context, the argument is that these experiments, these attempts on the part of nature, are not the point. They're not the telos. There is no telos. The music box repeats its tune. It's not a melody, right? So in other words, the universe is simply doing its thing, for lack of a better phrase, to no point, no purpose. All the imposition of points and purposes come from us. If we apply our reason, we must see that nature has no so-called secret aims. And so the eternal repetition Nietzsche speaks of here, I think, refers to the fact that ultimately there's no end for existence itself. Even his overman idea that he'll eventually put forward in the following book, the idea that these natural experiments, most of which are botched, will eventually elevate the species through an exceptional type being created, that's not the end of nature itself, because eventually the species will come to naught. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Even life itself may one day do so. The universe doesn't have life in mind as its aim. As Nietzsche writes elsewhere, one day our star will grow cold here on Earth, and we clever animals will have to die. And presumably that wastefulness of nature, that squandering, will go on eternally. It's an eternally repeating tune that never constitutes a melody because it has no structure. It never goes anywhere. So while this sentence may be tangentially related to eternal return, the invocation of the eternally repeating music box, I think, has a very different sense to it in this passage specifically. It's very different, the point that Nietzsche is trying to get across in this passage versus the point he's trying to get across in the passage The Greatest Weight, which we'll eventually get to in this read-through. The point here is to say all of this comes to naught. All of nature's activity leads nowhere. Not even the striving of all life and all nature comes to anything, except insofar as we impose those goals. We create those goals for ourselves. That's not in nature. And Nietzsche really doesn't go so far as to say that last point that I just made, but I think that's sort of the implication here. Now, where this passage is most difficult, I think, is in Nietzsche's denial of order or regularity or pattern to the universe. And part of the reason why it's difficult is because Nietzsche is almost certainly wrong here if we accept modern astrophysics, because planets and heavenly bodies do seem to act in a predictable way. It doesn't seem as though chaos does govern the heavens. But perhaps to steelman Nietzsche, I can imagine that he might say in counter to this, if he had modern scientific knowledge, that we don't know how much of the universe our so-called known universe even accounts for. And if we expand our definition of universe to include multiverses, we could say that we have an almost infinitesimally small view of existence. And based on that small, infinitesimally small sliver of existence that we're privy to and don't even fully understand, we feel confident to make these sweeping pronouncements about universal physical laws and patterns. And yet, science itself ought to humble us here, as we learn that by shifting the scale from, for example, from the very big to the very small, our theoretical frameworks start to break down. The kind of physics that works on the very large scale completely fails in the quantum level and vice versa. And all sorts of things occur on the quantum level that would seem to be quote-unquote chaotic from the perspective of either classical physics or just from the perceptions that we have in the so-called middle world that we inhabit as human beings, the world of our ordinary perception. Now, the positivistic types don't really like these arguments because oftentimes they're invoked by people who it's like a prelude to doing pseudoscientific mischief. But that isn't Nietzsche's point here. If anything, he would say the opposite tendency is just as dangerous, this mindset that we ought to confidently assert the authority of current scientific knowledge in order to ward off the pseuds. That's liable to lead you to vest undue faith in your hypotheses that if you were being thoroughly scientific, you would recognize as merely provisional. And that's all that science can provide us with is provisional hypotheses that are inevitably outmoded by future discoveries. But the other way in which this passage becomes difficult is Nietzsche's assertion that chaos is the rule. Isn't that itself unpermitted? That would be another anthropomorphic reflection. And in this case, it would be another reflection that reveals Nietzsche's inner content more so than anything about the universe. That being said, I think there's a real point to be made about the idea of rejecting natural laws. Nietzsche does reject that notion, and it's a very important aspect to his thought. But first, let's make clear what he's not saying. He's not saying we can't test and repeat experiments. He's not saying we find no order or regularity to the world. He's not saying that we might not apprehend what appears to be a law according to empirical data, or what seems to be a law for us. People often kind of freak out that this kind of postmodern stuff in Nietzsche, they think it's the point is to invalidate all scientific knowledge or something, but that's not the argument. The argument is related to what we were just speaking of, the fallibility of the human mind, the limitations on our knowledge, the problem of induction, just the boundedness of our perspective. What Nietzsche is reminding us of is the inescapability of perspective that's suffused with all of our knowledge. There's no perspectiveless knowledge. There's no view from nowhere. There's no immaculate perception. There's only knowledge with perspective or from a certain perspective. There's only a view from somewhere, from some scale of existence or from some form of sensory intake. And it's always processed through the human mind. And given that we aren't really, able to make any claims about so-called natural laws, we can only say that certain things we perceive from within our perspective appear to us to conform to certain laws. But those laws, we can even see through some thought experiments how if we shift our perspective, those laws don't seem to apply anymore, or they just appear in a completely different way. So one of the things Nietzsche writes elsewhere, this is in his lectures on the pre-Platonics, is that if we experience time at 10,000 times the rate that we experience time now, everything solid and enduring, which seems to have duration, would flash past us in the blink of an eye. And then that leads you to question, well, what is it for something to have duration? How long does something have to endure for us to say that it's like a stable single phenomenon, right? Is a drop of water a single phenomenon? Well, when it hits the pond, it rejoins all the other water molecules, right? But when the drop of water is flying through the air, it seems to be a separate phenomenon. But what is that based on? Well, it's based on the fact that it holds a certain shape for a certain period of time. But finding exactly what that threshold of how long something has to appear to hold its shape in order to be considered an enduring phenomenal body or something of that nature really depends on, again, your perspective. If we were to examine an apparently solid object on the submolecular level, we would perceive a world that is, from our perspective, chaotic and bears no resemblance to the world of our senses. And so there is a point to calling the universe basically chaos, insofar as Nietzsche is arguing we can't separate our attempts to give order to existence from the human mind. Order, arrangement, form, beauty, wisdom. He calls all of these aesthetic anthropomorphisms because they're all impositions on the world. And so he says, nature doesn't strive in any way to imitate man. None of our judgments apply to it. That's why it can be called neither heartless nor compassionate, neither intelligent nor irrational, neither living nor dead. All of those qualifiers, when you apply them to the totality, stop making sense. And part of the reason for this is that no qualifier, no adjective, no category can embrace the whole of existence. How could it? Our knowledge is only a sliver of existence, and all our conceptual categories are a means of dividing up and making sense of that sliver. If we try to create a conceptual category that applies to the whole thing, in some sense you're violating the very use of conceptual categories, because conceptual knowledge always carves things up. It takes a chaotic whole and sorts it into little boxes. But what box do you put the whole thing into? Now, obviously you can give it a name, like nature or existence or the universe, but the moment you attribute content to that name, the moment it becomes anything more than an X, a placeholder, you're trying to use human reason for something that's beyond the scope of its abilities. At the risk of being a bit crass, Wittgenstein once said, "Don't try to shit higher than your ass." So, now what does Nietzsche mean when he invokes the god of the Eleatics? That refers to the Eleatic school of philosophers. The most famous figures are Parmenides and Zeno. You probably know Zeno's paradox that attempts to disprove the reality of motion, and Parmenides is the founder of the school. He's sort of like the inverse of Heraclitus. He says, there's no becoming, only being. That which is not, by definition, does not exist, therefore only being exists. And that which is, that which constitutes being, is what is, not what will be or what was, which means that change within being is impossible. And so all change, all movement, all time, all becoming is an illusion. And Parmenides describes existence as being, in truth, like a great spherical object of which we're all a part. And in fact, even to say that is incorrect because there are no parts, there's no pieces, there's no empty space within the totality of being. The truth is only being. That's the sole reality. Everything else is a logical error that we are making. Why does Nietzsche invoke the Eleatics here? Well, it's a bit complicated because what he's actually attacking is atomism. And here we mean atomism in the sense of an attempt to find a bedrock of material existence, some foundation of being, in order to say that things exist, or, the atoms at least exist. Because designating an individual phenomenon as independently existing is rather difficult. That's the critique the Buddhists make, the dependent origination of all phenomena. That actually, in the final analysis, there are no independently existent things. The tree is inseparable from the root system, which is inseparable from a mycelial network. The whole forest is inseparable from the oxygen atmosphere, which is inseparable from the oceans and all the respirating organisms. And you can basically extend the argument to every apparently individual thing and say it's actually connected to everything else, insofar as its existence isn't even rigorously imaginable without the other things upon which it is dependent. Atomism gets you out of that because the atomist can say there is a real existence, which is the atom. And it need not be the atom in the modern sense, which is not really an atom in the classical sense, because what we understand atoms to be, those could be broken down into subatomic particles. In the classical sense, the term atom does refer to a bedrock. It's the smallest possible unit of being. The atom in the work of Democritus, for example, is a non-interpenetrating, enduring unity. And Nietzsche argues that doesn't exist. Quote, "There are no eternally enduring substances. Matter is as much of an error as the god of the Eleatics," end quote. And so, why does he bring up the Eleatics and not Democritus? Because the Eleatics are the ones who put forward that pure theory of being. And Nietzsche is saying that notion, fantastical as it is, discounted so often as it is, because why should it be the case that all reality as we experience it is an illusion? How do you get from A to B? Why, if there is only being, do we experience non-being? Do we make the error of having all these sense impressions that trick us? So how do you get from a pure theory of being to this world as we experience it? It's a rather fantastical claim, and that's the main flaw of the Eleatic school. So Nietzsche is saying this theory of the atom, of some sort of substance, some sort of enduring being to matter, is just as fantastical as that Eleatic notion of being. And Nietzsche's been somewhat vindicated here because, beneath atoms are subatomic particles, beneath those are quarks, beneath that, we once thought there might be vibrating strings, but it seems likely, will we ever reach a bedrock? It seems like you can always kind of go smaller or larger with the scale of your analysis of phenomena. And this is why Nietzsche was very interested in the work of Boscovich. Discussing that would take us too far afield for this episode, but the episode's back in season 2 about the will to power as science. You can learn more about that, but basically seeing reality as like fields and believing in force point particles instead of atoms, which force point particles are interpenetrating and they do action at a distance and all of these things. Again, that kind of takes us really too far beyond the gay science. But in any case, I think we should see the main thrust of the latter half of this passage as directed at atomism. And I think there is actually some weight to that critique. But in any case, Nietzsche concludes this section by saying, quote, "When will all these shadows of God cease to darken our minds? When will we complete our de-deification of nature? When may we begin to naturalize humanity in terms of a pure, newly discovered, newly redeemed nature?" End quote. And, Heidegger said that Nietzsche was really attempting to return us to paganism, because we could say his view of a redeemed nature is a nature free from these attempts at a monistic embrace of the entirety of the universe. These are attempts to deify nature. These are attempts to take that multiplicity, that chaos, that incomprehensibility of nature, and sort of have done with it. Have done with the fact that man stands as this small, ignorant, fallible perspective faced by this multitude of forces, or we might say gods, and instead of that, comprehend the whole universe in some way that anthropomorphizes it into a living being or a machine or a set of laws or whatever. And notice that Nietzsche never brings up the notion of the universe as the creation of a loving God. I would say the implication there is that all of these interpretations that he brings up in the passage are shadows of that monotheistic urge to reduce nature to one perspective, and thus, by that same token, to deny perspective, by that same token, to deny that perception and perspective are linked. And so this passage makes his use of the term shadow of God very clear. The shadow of God is not just the hangover of religious beliefs, as even regards, say, our values or our morals or our social conventions, or, superficially the fact that people still identify nominally as Christians and go to church even if they don't really believe. The shadow of God looms over our thought, even in the way that we perceive and interpret the world, even in the way in which we attempt to grapple with our place in the universe, and even in apparently secular interpretations of the universe, that it's a mechanistic machine or a living being or governed by laws. That too is a hangover of monotheism. When a Richard Dawkins type atheist goes on and on about natural laws, he is consciously or otherwise capitulating to the idea of a personified ruler, or at least a governing body, compelling the universe to behave in a certain way. When a determinist calls the world a machine, he's perhaps unconsciously giving in to the notion of nature having a telos. And so that's the lasting significance of the shadow of Christian monotheism on even apparently secular scientific interpretations of the world, and maybe even especially so. Because, in the Christian, there's an explanation, there's at least an element of myth and the fantastical and the miraculous, whereas once you get philosophical and metaphysical with it, once you get dogmatic and absolutist and strictly logical in your thinking, you tend to not like the exceptional, the miracles, things like that, of that nature that violate natural laws. So they might even be even more dogmatic in some ways. And just as a final note that takes us beyond the scope of this passage, you might be wondering, what about will to power? Isn't that a sort of monistic explanation of existence? And fair enough. Nietzsche does say in The Will to Power, I believe it's the last note that they include in the book version of Nietzsche's notes, Will to Power. is, do you want to know what the world is to me? Shall I show it to you in my mirror? Right? That's how he presents his idea that the whole world is will to power, is something that he's showing us that's a reflection of himself. And we have to think of philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks and his lectures on the pre-Platonics, the way that, again, there was artfulness and subjectivity, the way that they philosophized by great leaps. He imagines Thales as sort of like an artist looking at a waterfall or a stream and seeing how all of these shapes and patterns might emerge out of the water, and then making an artistic leap from that one way to describe this existence is to speak of it all as one, is that all is water, something of that nature. And so on some level, that's what Nietzsche is doing with will to power, but he's self-aware of the fact, as we know from this passage, that it again is a reflection of himself, that he is, as the way he talks about Thales, causing all of existence to resound with the single chord that chimes out of himself, or however he puts it. The other interesting thing is that will to power is a interpretation of the world that allows for becoming, change, multiplicity, difference as well. That's really the key point, though. Will to power is multiple, it's moving. One could almost venture to say that what Nietzsche is attempting to do with will to power is to give some sort of interpretation of existence itself that accounts for the chaos that he says in this passage, our reason ought to tell us the universe truly is. And of course, that is a Promethean or Icarus-like attempt to make in the world of philosophy because of how paradoxical it is. But there you have it. That's my apologia for the will to power in light of this passage. So let's move on now to number 110. Quote, "Origin of knowledge. Over immense periods of time, the intellect produced nothing but errors. A few of these proved to be useful and helped to preserve the species. Those who hit upon or inherited these had better luck in their struggle for themselves and their progeny. Such erroneous articles of faith, which were continually inherited until they became almost part of the basic endowment of the species, include the following: that there are enduring things, that there are equal things, that there are things, substances, bodies, that a thing is what it appears to be, that our will is free, that what is good for me is also good in itself. It was only very late that such propositions were denied and doubted. It was only very late that truth emerged as the weakest form of knowledge. It seemed that one was unable to live with it. Our organism was prepared for the opposite. All its higher functions, sense perception, and every kind of sensation worked with those basic errors which had been incorporated since time immemorial. Indeed, even in the realm of knowledge, these propositions became the norms according to which true and untrue were determined, down to the most remote regions of logic." End quote. And we'll stop there. There's more of the passage, but we're going to stop here for analysis. So these ideas in this passage, difficult as they are, I think very nicely help to disentangle what might be some of the problems that people might have with Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics as producing a world behind appearance, but then his attacks on all of these scientific or empirical apparent certainties, because you could say, isn't Nietzsche creating a true world behind the appearances by attacking these apparent immediate certainties that we have? And what Nietzsche would say is that he's not attacking the world of sensation. He's not attacking the immediate certainties of sensation. He's attacking the thought structures, the interpretations that we have of those sensations, which are ultimately representations in some form. And that, I think the line is wonderful, that knowledge, or that truth was the weakest form of knowledge originally. So the problem is in the world of intelligibility. It's not in the sensations itself. In some sense, a sensation doesn't require any further explanation. Now, before we go further with analyzing this passage, I want to compare it to some remarks he makes at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil that I think will be helpful for getting his points here to click with you if they haven't already. This is from section 4 of Beyond Good and Evil. Quote, The falseness of a judgment is for us not necessarily an objection to a judgment. It is here perhaps that our new language sounds most strangely. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. And we are fundamentally inclined to claim that the falsest judgments, to which the synthetic judgments a priori belong, are the most indispensable to us, that without a recognition of logical fictions, without a comparison of reality with the purely imagined world of the absolute and immutable, without a constant counterfeiting of the world by means of numbers, man could not live. That the renunciation of false judgments would be a renunciation of life, a negation of life. To recognize untruth as a condition of life, that is certainly to impugn the traditional ideas of value in a dangerous manner, and a philosophy which ventures to do so has thereby alone placed itself beyond good and evil." End quote. So a lot of people take that section in Beyond Good and Evil as like an incitement for us to believe in empowering fictions, perhaps in the manner of, say, Plato's magnificent myth, or the enchantment of the world provided by religion, such that if you were to say, out of context, the falseness of a judgment is no objection to it, rather, is it life-preserving? That's how someone like Peterson reads Nietzsche. He would say, well, Christianity is life-preserving. The moral framework of the West is a necessary enchantment of the world, and we abandon all of that at our own peril. Now, I'm not going to say that that isn't included in what Nietzsche's talking about here, but we should pay attention to the actual concrete things he says, the actual examples he gives here. Logical fictions, the purely imagined world of the absolute and immutable. Constant counterfeiting, another translation has it as falsification, counterfeiting of the world by means of numbers. So Nietzsche isn't talking about noble lies in terms of life-invigorating myths for motivating behavior. I mean, he's talking about numbers, right? He's saying numbers are a falsification. Why are numbers a falsification? Because to say there's two of something requires an equation of unequal things. There are, in fact, no duplicates of things. There are phenomena that are similar to one another, which we class into the same category based on an ideal of the thing, a Platonic form of the thing. What else? Well, he's talking about the idea of enduring substances. Remember our discussion about the atom earlier, the desire to find some bedrock of unified, independent, enduring being. And so, to return to the passage in the Gay Science, what are these erroneous articles of faith that he mentions here that were useful and helped to preserve the species? Enduring things, equal things, or even the idea that there are things, period, that a thing is what it appears, that our will is free, that the good from my perspective is the universal good, the good from all perspectives. Nietzsche says these are all errors, but they all preserved the species. This means that it would be a serious error on our part, or the part of any interpreter of this text, if we read this passage as a for or against. Now, granted, in other places in his work, Nietzsche does occasionally take up for or against, one or another of these concepts. He writes pages and pages against the idea of free will. He says in Twilight of Idols, Heraclitus will remain eternally correct that being is an empty fiction. In other words, that from the highest standpoint of reason, there are no things, no substances, no bodies. But does this mean that we should try to live without these falsifications? Or even that we can live without them? That's perhaps the bigger point here. We already brought up the problem of separating an individual thing from its broader environment, of establishing something as independently existing. But why do we perceive things as independently existing? Not logically, but from the standpoint of survivability, adaptability. Because if you conceive of the tiger charging at you as indistinguishable from the rest of the forest, then you get eaten, right? And that points to the fact that these errors are survivable errors. They're life-preserving errors. Now, in truth, from the dispassionate God's eye view of science, we might say that the kind of science Nietzsche's talking about, right? It would be true that the designation tiger is an arbitrary line that you're drawing. It's a line that you draw from your specific perspective, and that the tiger is not quote-unquote one thing. You could say it's a collection of trillions of chaotic particles. If you were a bacterium, you would experience the phenomenon of the tiger very differently, just by changing the scale once again. And, so it's all these particles amalgamated into a phenomenon which is inseparable from the forest around you. But you're a human being. You're not living in the dispassionate position of a God's eye view, right? We see by means of our human head. We experience the world in terms of these categories, these apparently individually existent phenomena, and we have no choice in the matter. We can't do otherwise, even if we would wish that we could. So what's the broader point in this first paragraph? That in fact, erroneous judgments became articles of faith, not because they're true knowledge, but because they advance the species, because we're unable to live without them. And truth, the fruits of the will to truth, the fruits of this pursuit of knowledge, which eventually yields up this idea of truth, the weakest form, the newest form of knowledge, but and eventually an impulse to pursue that truth. And I mean truth here in the way that Nietzsche pursues it, a kind of will to truth that questions and interrogates everything, even questions and interrogates those indispensable judgments that we can't live without. That's a late arrival in human intellectual life, to the point where our whole metaphysical world, our whole intelligible world, is actually dominated by these false judgments. Dominated by doesn't even work. It's like the oxygen, it's the building blocks of that entire false world. So let's continue with the passage again. Quote, "Thus, the strength of knowledge does not depend on its degree of truth, but on its age, on the degree to which it has been incorporated, on its character as a condition of life. Where life and knowledge seemed to be at odds, there was never any real fight, but denial and doubt were simply considered madness. Those exceptional thinkers, like the Eleatics, who nevertheless posited and clung to the opposites of the natural errors, believed that it was possible to live in accordance with these opposites. They invented the sage as the man who was unchangeable and impersonal, the man of the universality of intuition who was one and all at the same time, with a special capacity for his inverted knowledge. They had the faith that their knowledge was also the principle of life. But in order to claim all this, they had to deceive themselves about their own state. They had to attribute to themselves, fictitiously, impersonality and changeless duration. They had to misapprehend the nature of the knower. They had to deny the role of impulses in knowledge. And quite generally, they had to conceive of reason as a completely free and spontaneous activity. They shut their eyes to the fact that they too had arrived at their propositions through opposition to common sense, or owing to a desire for tranquility, for sole possession, or for dominion. The subtler development of honesty and skepticism eventually made these people, too, impossible. Their ways of living and judging were seen to be also dependent upon the primeval impulses and basic errors of all sentient existence." End quote. So, the first major point that Nietzsche makes, he would put rather straightforwardly in the book before this, Daybreak. And he says there, truth requires power, or in this context, the judgments, the beliefs, the ideas that survive, the ideas that have strength or power behind them are what preserves life, what enhances life, what makes life stronger. What most people believe in are beliefs that are old, that seem tried and true. It really has nothing to do with being logically ironclad, but with being strong in the sense of being functional, right? Being adaptable. And Nietzsche brings up the Eleatics again, whom we just discussed. His point in bringing them up almost seems like a counterpoint, insofar as they might seem like an exception. But here we have an important meditation on Nietzsche's will to power, because he makes the argument that, in fact, the Eleatics were doing the same thing as everyone else. He says they seem to attack these, quote, natural errors, as he calls them, meaning things like the notion of substance, that there are things, by positing their unchanging one, the totality of being that doesn't move, does not become. But Nietzsche says, in order to claim all this, what did they have to do? They had to imagine their reason as an independently acting force and an independent activity. They arrived at their propositions. Why? Quote, owing to a desire for tranquility, for sole possession, or for dominion, end quote. So even when reason appears to operate independently of our impulses or of these natural errors, it's being driven by something else other than this dispassionate will to truth. The desire to take sole possession over one's truths or to live in tranquility apart from the errors of other men as a kind of sage. He sort of presents this as the image at the base of their philosophizing. The conception of reason as this independently operating faculty is posited by the kind of person who's edified by that conception of reason. And so eventually these kinds of people become impossible, as Nietzsche puts it. Quote, their ways of living and judging were seen to be also dependent upon the primeval impulses and basic errors of all sentient existence, end quote. What does he mean by this? Well, one of those natural errors Nietzsche listed earlier is that the good for me is a good for all and forever. The denial of perspective and lapse into universalist thinking that characterizes so much of philosophy. And so too the Eleatic attempts to make their particular form of knowledge into the principle of all life and all existence. So let's finish out this passage now. I'll read through the rest of it. Quote, this subtler honesty and skepticism came into being wherever two contradictory sentences appeared to be applicable to life because both were compatible with the basic errors. And it was therefore possible to argue about the higher or lower degree of utility for life. Also, wherever new propositions, though not useful for life, were also evidently not harmful to life. In such cases, there was room for the expression of an intellectual play impulse, and honesty and skepticism were innocent and happy like all play. Gradually, the human brain became full of such judgments and convictions, and a ferment, struggle, and lust for power developed in this tangle. Not only utility and delight, but every kind of impulse took sides in this fight about, quote, truths. The intellectual fight became an occupation, an attraction, a profession, a duty, something dignified. And eventually knowledge, and the striving for the true, found their place as a need among other needs. Henceforth, not only faith and conviction, but also scrutiny, denial, mistrust, and contradiction became a power. All evil instincts were subordinated to knowledge, employed in her service, and acquired the splendor of what is permitted, honored, and useful, and eventually even the eye and innocence of the good. Thus knowledge became a piece of life itself, and hence a continually growing power, until eventually knowledge collided with those primeval basic errors, two lives, two powers, both in the same human being. A thinker is now that being in whom the impulse for truth and those life-preserving errors clash for their first fight, after the impulse for truth has proved to be also a life-preserving power. Compared to the significance of this fight, everything else is a matter of indifference. The ultimate question about the conditions of life has been posed here, and we confront the first attempt to answer this question by experiment. To what extent can truth endure incorporation? That is the question. That is the experiment, end quote. So, in these following paragraphs, wherever there were debates or contestations between competing judgments, it originally was not a contest between truth and error. It was a contest between two errors to see which of the two preserves life the best or advances it the best. And this is a real key, I think, to understanding the way Nietzsche conceives of his own project in this book, that he's not apart from these natural errors. He wraps himself up into his own critiques. Nietzsche is another teacher of the purpose of existence for all of the flaws of that role, and accordingly he's promoting another set of errors. Again, from the highest standpoint of reason, the idea of nature as an experiment is also an error, and yet that's the viewpoint that Nietzsche promotes. And in any case, Nietzsche uses the term lust for power. He says it has entangled itself in the struggle. That's another sort of prefiguration of the will to power, as he hasn't used that term yet. But it's clearly here, even though it doesn't have its name. Quote, not only utility and delight, but every kind of impulse took sides in this fight about quote-unquote truths, end quote. And that's what Nietzsche says about the will to power. The will to power is not one thing. It's not a monism behind reality. It's a description of how the multitude of forces behaves. Will to power is something that appears, not something hidden behind the appearance. Every impulse has its own will, its own move or drive towards power, and it's attempting to discharge itself into the world, express itself. Every impulse is. And so utility, delight, and every kind of impulse take part in the fight. Utility we could translate as that which gives advantage. Delight, we might say that which pleases us, or that which comforts us. And meanwhile, there are all these other moral or immoral impulses within the physiology. And all of these contest with one another within the so-called battle of ideas, which is a battle for which judgments are to be called true and which are to be called errors. And the insight here is that, at least originally, it's not even a battle of ideas, it's a battle of impulses, over which ideas shall be seized upon and interpreted in a certain way. And so Nietzsche says however, that as knowledge is useful, as knowledge is instrumentalized and seized upon in this battle between competing impulses, eventually knowledge becomes a craving unto itself. The intellectual fight becomes a pastime. It becomes an occupation. It becomes a way of holding or expressing power. And so, as with all things that we call virtues, the vices become conscripted in the fight. Because any source of power, any arena of power in human life becomes a playground or a battleground of vices. So scrutiny, denial, mistrust, and contradiction. These are all aspects of, we might also think of here Socrates and his relationship to the Athenians and how his questioning, his irony, his mistrust, his doubtfulness, these were all seen as vices and not virtues during that time. So we might say many of these aspects that become key to science and the pursuit of knowledge originally are considered vices. They're originally considered bad manners in good society. But in any case, all of these sort of are allowed to come out and play insofar as science and the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth, becomes something seen as valuable, something that men can do with a good conscience. And in the last paragraph, we kind of see the great contradiction Nietzsche feels within himself. And if I may be so bold as to say so, I think most philosophical or reflective people feel this contradiction as well. That two lives or two powers exist in the same human being. That is to say, the power of truth in this sense of the true will to truth, the true pursuit of truth, right? The actual delight in knowledge, for its own sake, perhaps. And the power of these natural errors which have masqueraded as truth, which may be indispensable but are ultimately errors, falsifications. And so we have both of those lives, Nietzsche describes it as, we might call complexes, right? This complex of indispensable errors and this complex of impulses toward truth-seeking coexisting within any modern thinker. That has become a part of what it means to be a thinker, right? It means to be a battleground between differing wills, right? And we philosophers have no other choice than to take part in this struggle. And yet that places us forever at odds with ourselves, right? And compared to the significance of this fight, everything else is a matter of indifference, right? Nothing matters compared to this. And much of these first passages in Book 3, I think could be compared to the same meditations that Nietzsche will revisit in Beyond Good and Evil. And I think it's a large part of why that is such a profound book, because this truly... It exposes what is truly the eternally paradoxical and, dare I say, insoluble struggle that takes place within the modern mind, or rather the postmodern mind, really. And so we have to call to mind Nietzsche's idea that perhaps the strength of a soul could be measured by how much truth it could tolerate. If natural error is needed in order to live, then the will to truth has to be seen as harmful to living beings. Or we might reinterpret it as a form of testing, right? As something you have to survive and endure. And that means that philosophy itself is another great experiment, another great test. Quote, to what extent can truth endure incorporation? That is the question, end quote. Or, so that's how Nietzsche puts it here in The Gay Science, or as he puts it in Beyond Good and Evil from the opposing perspective, to what extent can we endure incorporating the truth? So with that, let's move on to 111. This is 111, entitled The Origin of the Logical. Quote, how did logic come into existence in man's head? Certainly out of illogic, whose realm originally must have been immense. Innumerable beings who made inferences in a different way from ours perished. For all that, their ways might have been truer. Those, for example, who did not know how to find often enough what is equal as regards both nourishment and hostile animals. Those, in other words, who subsumed things too slowly and cautiously, were favored with a lesser probability of survival than those who guessed immediately upon encountering similar instances that they must be equal. The dominant tendency, however, to treat as equal what is merely similar, an illogical tendency, for nothing is really equal, is what first created any basis for logic, end quote. So we've already considered what Nietzsche calls the falsification of the world by means of numbers, but here it is again, explicitly, nothing is really equal. To treat as equal what is merely similar is illogical. And yet, whoever or whatever did not possess that tendency would have had a hard time surviving in this world. You have to be able to categorize things as predators or prey, or whatever the category might be. You need these conceptual boxes, however false they may be. We could also compare the beginning of this passage to a passage from Daybreak entitled Rationality, where Nietzsche writes, quote, "How did rationality arrive in the world? Irrationally, as might be expected by a chance accident." End quote. And so here in The Gay Science, Nietzsche says, illogic exists first, and by chance accident, some forms of illogic are more life-preserving, and so they continue on. And much of this is sort of a recapitulation to what he's already said before, but the really interesting phrase in this first paragraph, quote, "Innumerable beings who made inferences in a way different from ours perished, and for all that their ways might have been truer," end quote. Now, obviously, Nietzsche has no way of knowing this in terms of absolute certainty. It's more like a deduction derived from, what Darwin would call natural selection. Nietzsche would say it's not actually a process of selecting. It's a meaningless squandering that occasionally produces results. But even again, results, quote unquote, only from the perspective of beings such as ourselves, not from the perspective of nature as a whole. So we ought to expect that organisms would arise with their own series of natural errors, as we've said. Perhaps errors which were closer to the truth, closer to, as Nietzsche will later say in this passage, the reality which is flux, Heraclitus's river. But there may have been no survivability in such perceptions. So let's continue with the passage. Quote, "In order that the concept of substance could originate, which is indispensable for logic, although in the strictest sense nothing real corresponds to it, it was likewise necessary that for a long time one did not see nor perceive the changes in things. The beings that did not see so precisely had an advantage over those that saw everything, quote, in flux. At bottom, every high degree of caution in making inferences and every skeptical tendency constitute a great danger for life. No living beings would have survived if the opposite tendency, to affirm rather than suspend judgment, to err and make up things rather than wait, to assent rather than negate, to pass judgment rather than to be just, had not been bred to the point where it had become extraordinarily strong. The course of logical ideas and inferences in our brain today corresponds to a process and a struggle among impulses that are, taken singly, very illogical and unjust. We generally experience only the result of this struggle because this primeval mechanism now runs its course so quickly and is so well concealed." End quote. So the organisms that see reality as pure becoming, pure flux, which is, to Nietzsche's mind, closer to the chaotic truth of things, would have perished. And that, to a large degree, is the point he's making here, as we've already kind of explored. So I'd like to focus on the other half of this passage, or the other insight in this passage, that caution and skepticism are an inherent danger. We might think of his musings on use and abuse of history for life, and in the genealogy, that forgetting is a very important thing. Forgetting clears the way for action. In other words, that having to acquire perfect knowledge before acting is the wrong way to think about it. It's actually paralyzing. That in the moment of action, you have to simply, act, right? And he says no living beings would have survived if we had nourished that tendency to be skeptical and withhold judgment, to wait until we could be sure that we were not committing an error. Because life is, after all, it's preferring, it's judging, it's being unjust. And here we mean unjust in the highest logical sense. I beat this example to death, but it's so useful. The good of the lion and the good of the gazelle are diametrically opposed. They're mutually exclusive, but both are just organisms doing what they do. Would it not be unjust of the lion to act according to its own good, ignoring the equally valid way of life of the gazelle? Well, it certainly would if we were to absurdly apply human standards of morality to that interaction between predator and prey. But that's how all life behaves. It unjustly prefers its own form of being. It unjustly prefers its own species, its own form of living. It destroys or preys upon other forms of being. And a lion which sat there and hemmed and hawed over whether preying on other mammals was the right thing to do or whether it was the just thing to do, that would be a maladaptive development if the lion began to think in that way. And so one might say that that's precisely the kind of intellectualizing that human beings do, and Nietzsche would say that's quite right. But there are a couple of things that have to be said in addendum to that observation. Namely, that for one, as Nietzsche would argue elsewhere, an organism that prefers what is harmful to it will perish. Meaning that Nietzsche would say that this moralization of the world, this desire to be perfectly logical and just, is, to some extent at least, maladaptive. And secondly, as has been his point throughout the passage, the very fact that we're able to occupy that position, the very fact that we are able to attempt, at least, to be rigorous and just and logical in our judgments, that's because we have survived and developed our intellect over long generations. Why were we able to do that? Why were we able to develop the intellect? Because of those illogical judgments, which were nevertheless more survivable. So that's a very concrete argument for why logic is built on this foundation of errors. All right, let's go to 112. Quote, cause and effect. Explanation is what we call it, but it is description that distinguishes us from older stages of knowledge and science. Our descriptions are better. We do not explain any more than our predecessors. We have uncovered a manyfold one after another, where the naive man and inquirer of older cultures saw only two separate things. Cause and effect is what one says, but we have merely perfected the image of becoming without reaching beyond the image or behind it. In every case, the series of causes confronts us much more completely, and we infer, first this and that has to proceed in order that this or that may then follow. But this does not involve any comprehension. In every chemical process, for example, quality appears as a miracle, as ever. Also, every locomotion. Nobody has explained a push, but how could we possibly explain anything? We operate only with things that do not exist. Lines, planes, bodies, atoms, divisible time spans, divisible spaces. How should explanations be at all possible when we turn everything into an image, our image? It will do to consider science as an attempt to humanize things as faithfully as possible. As we describe things in their one after another, we learn how to describe ourselves more precisely. Cause and effect. Such a duality probably never exists. In truth, we are confronted by a continuum, out of which we isolate a couple of pieces, just as we perceive motion only as isolated points, and then infer it without ever actually seeing it. The suddenness with which many effects stand out misleads us. Actually, it is sudden only for us. In this moment of suddenness, there is an infinite number of processes that elude us. An intellect that could see cause and effect as a continuum and a flux, and not, as we do, in terms of an arbitrary division and dismemberment, would repudiate the concept of cause and effect and deny all conditionality. End quote. This is a very hard passage, just in the way that it attacks the basic presuppositions that pretty much everyone with a modern mind believes in. And it's where I'm the iffiest on following along with Nietzsche, at least when it comes to his metaphysical critiques and so on and so forth. But I think there's a very important point here. And I think thankfully Nietzsche has prepared us for this in these previous sections that we've gone through. Much of what we've already discussed about the falsification of the world through the natural errors of the intellect, that's incredibly useful here to keep in mind. But, Nietzsche's comments on causality, it's usually very tough for people to handle because he's critical of causality, and I would say most people would say it's almost impossible to deny causality. And I've gotten some comments on my video about the Four Great Errors passage, for example, where people say, well, Nietzsche isn't actually critiquing the idea of causality here. He's just pointing out errors in our thinking about causality, but he doesn't deny it. And that's true. I say that in the video. In that particular passage, he's not really denying cause and effect. But as I sometimes also point out to these people, regardless of that, yes, Nietzsche does critique causality itself in other passages. It's not just our thinking about it or our uses for it. He attacks causality itself. Now, on the broadest level, his critique is this. There are an infinite number of processes that elude us, as he says, meaning you say X caused Y, but you forgot about W, V, U, T, S, R, Q, and so on and so forth. And I don't just mean the previous causes before that one, quote unquote, Consider the total net of factors that produces any phenomenon. Events are not ever caused by one thing. Even the division between things is sort of a falsification, but things are caused by a multitude of conditions, and some or even most of those are not, or maybe even cannot be, perceived by us. Now add to this the division of cause from effect, or cause from cause, because presumably in a chain of causes and effects, each previous cause is also an effect, and so on and so forth. That division is completely arbitrary. Does precipitation, quote unquote, cause the water line of the lake to rise? Well, sure, it does, if we halt our analysis right there and don't take anything else into account in the past or in the future. But if we realize that halting, that stopping at an arbitrary point, is another mental falsification, then we would see that actually the water cycle is a continuous process, that the precipitation was caused by a previous evaporation of water, that's not where we should halt our analysis either, because the water cycle has been going on since time immemorial, right? And meanwhile, it's not localized to one lake or one region. It's going on all over the planet. And so as Nietzsche says, quote, "We are confronted by a continuum out of which we isolate a couple of pieces, just as we perceive motion only as isolated points and then infer it without ever actually seeing it," end quote. So another way of stating Nietzsche's comments on motion there is, an object is at position A and then it's at position B, and we say the object moved. It was at A, now it's at B, therefore motion has occurred. Nietzsche would say that's sort of, that's another post hoc explanation, or it doesn't really explain anything. It just describes it in a certain way. You haven't explained anything. This isn't because Nietzsche is saying in the real reality or whatever, motion isn't real, in the true world, causality isn't real. Nietzsche couldn't possibly make that claim, could he? He's saying, given our world of appearance, our world of perception, what are we doing? We're isolating a piece of the flux that we perceive. We call it an individual phenomenon or a cause or an effect, and we always have to halt our analysis at a certain point in order for it to be explanatory. Because if we allow the analysis to go on, it could stretch to expand and encompass the entirety of reality. Because no cause occurs independently. There aren't first causes that we see blip into being. We have a continuous becoming all around us, and only by stopping, only by drawing a line, do we have any notion of cause and effect. And this is true of all these mental fictions. Quote, "lines, planes, bodies, atoms, divisible time spans, divisible spaces," end quote. It's always the act of dividing, of segmenting, of designating this thing alone, separated from the rest of reality. That's what falsifies reality. And once again, is that not a natural error to make, right? Is that not an adaptive error to make? It may simply be the case that we can't cognize the world without making these errors. The bigger insight is that none of this is explanatory, though, in the same way that motion is not explanatory. Quote, "How should explanations be at all possible when we first turn everything into an image, our image," end quote. So it's not as if science hasn't advanced. Science, seen from this perspective as the study of appearance, which means the study of perspective, we have better descriptions of the world, more comprehensive. Maybe we could even say they're more life-enhancing. Maybe they're even more driven by that impulse to the truth. But none of it transcends perspective. None of it comes to us independently of the human mind. And to think about any of it, it has to be translated into this mental structure of, again, lines, planes, bodies, atoms, divisions of time and space, none of which exist in a mind-independent sense. And yet those are precisely the things that we say are mind-independent truths, right? Numbers are the one thing that how can we claim they exist independently of the human mind? They're inventions of the human mind, and yet they're absolutely indispensable to comprehending any concrete claims about physics as it obtains over reality. Where would physics be without these arbitrary divisions, without the falsification of the world by means of numbers? Nowhere. But it never reaches the point of explaining. Physics can only describe, it can never explain, for the precise reason that it doesn't transcend the human. Let's look at a final passage today which finishes out this section on the sciences and on Nietzsche's anti-metaphysical project. His critique of the ways in which the shadow of God looms over our apparently secular scientific thinking. That has been the theme of this whole kind of opening salvos of Book 3. So this is 113, quote, "On the doctrine of poisons. So many things have come together for scientific thinking to originate, and all these necessary strengths had to be invented, practiced, and cultivated separately. As long as they were still separate, however, they frequently had an altogether different effect than they do now, that they are integrated into scientific thinking and hold each other in check. Their effect was that of poisons. For example, that of the impulse to doubt, to negate, to wait, to collect, to dissolve. Many hecatombs of human beings were sacrificed before these impulses learned to comprehend their coexistence and to feel that they were all functions of one organizing force within one human being. And even now the time seems remote when artistic energies and the practical wisdom of life will join with scientific thinking to form a higher organic system in relation to which scholars, physicians, artists, and legislators, as we know them at present, would have to look like paltry relics of ancient times." End quote. So Nietzsche has talked about this in some of the previous passages. How many of the impulses that make up the scientific impulse or constitute the grand activity of science may have once been vices or once been harmful, maybe even objectively speaking they were harmful, but at least were seen that way. And again, thinking here of the animal in the state of nature who doubts and suspends judgment, who waits to have perfect knowledge before acting. What promotes life is being able to forget all that and simply act. So we could see many of these tendencies in thought, the impulse to doubt, to negate, to wait, to collect, to dissolve, as Nietzsche puts it. We could see these as poisons, as that which is hostile to the life-promoting natural errors, hostile to the life-promoting force of forgetful action, and so harmful to the organism in the grand scheme of things, in the final analysis. And yet Nietzsche says, for the project of science, these poisonous impulses somehow hold one another in check. All of these things had to come together for scientific thinking to emerge fully, and in a way that's remarkable. It's a thing to marvel at. All these impulses, which ought to have spelled the doom of the organism, coalesced into something which has the potential to be, in totality, a path to the future elevation of the species. And Nietzsche says many hecatombs were sacrificed as these impulses developed. So in the way that innumerable organisms who calculated or judged differently than we do, and perhaps in truer ways, nevertheless perished, think of how many human beings had to perish for the sake of science to emerge. Maybe it's a trite example, but we might think of how, in the Old Testament, there are prohibitions against eating like certain types of seafood. And some have speculated, this may be incorrect, but let's just go with it as a thought experiment. Some have speculated that these prohibitions may have been useful for people in the ancient Near East because maybe eating some types of shellfish may have made you susceptible to, different diseases or something. And we can imagine a scientifically minded person coming along to say, I'm not going to go along with this superstition of the priests, their ban on these foods. I doubt they even know what they're talking about. I'm suspending my judgment on that. I'm not going to act according to your revelation. I'm going to test this out. And then maybe they died because they were wrong for the right reasons, right? Maybe there actually was some sort of adaptive element of this. I'm sure many of you have seen Oppenheimer, and I kind of miss the days when I could bring up this fact as an interesting tidbit that was not known by virtually everyone on Earth, which it is now after that movie came out. But, some of the scientists who worked in the atomic bomb thought that perhaps the sequence of detonations would actually ignite the atmosphere and kill the entirety of the planet. Suppose that had actually happened. Talk about hecatombs of souls sacrificed for the sake of science. How about the entirety of all life on Earth sacrificed in the name of science? And such a thing is certainly possible. There's no law of the universe preventing it. But the most interesting thing in the passage is Nietzsche's hope at the end that perhaps other forces can join with those impulses that comprise the scientific project. He mentions artistic energies and the practical wisdom of life. And this is, again, another meaning to Nietzsche's gay science, the combination of science and art. As he put it in Human All Too Human, a chemistry of concepts and feelings, the joining of artfulness, self-aware subjectivity, and ultimately unreason, irrationality, the joining together of all that with the project of discerning the nature of reality through reason, through empirical reason. and that the coalescence of all this together will make all of these old types, the scholars, the physicians, the artists, the legislators, look like relics of an earlier time. And so we might imagine that the kind of thinker that Nietzsche is suggesting here might combine all of these types, and yet by that token transcend all of them. That this is a figure who will be scholarly, an intellectual, but also an artist. They'll recognize the element of artistry in the very act of thinking. And they'll also be a physician. They'll recognize the origin of all thought in the physical, in the physiology. And they'll be a legislator, recognizing that all thinking is judging, it's valuing, and so daring to perhaps reevaluate values or something of that sort. What might we call this new type of individual? Nietzsche has not coined the term yet, but perhaps we might call him a philosopher of the future. That's all for this week, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Very excited to cover Book 3 of The Gay Science, one of the best books Nietzsche wrote. It only goes uphill from here, so it's just all very exciting. So thank you. See you next time for the continuation of Book 3. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.